In the heart of Ambershade, a seemingly perfect life unraveled into tragedy and despair. What began as a midlife crisis for a devoted husband and father escalated into a series of decisions that ended in his untimely death. How did a man once known for his stability and love for his family spiral into such a devastating outcome? Ambershade is a city where historic cobblestone streets meet modern skyscrapers along a winding river. From the grand homes of Willow Heights to the lively parks of Maple Grove, the city is vibrant and diverse. Yet, beneath its charm, stress and personal struggles often linger. Nolan Whitaker is a civil engineer in his early 50s, tall and distinguished, with salt and pepper hair. Nolan appears to lead a successful life with a thriving career and a loving family. However, beneath his polished exterior, Nolan is grappling with deep dissatisfaction. The pressure of maintaining his high status and unfulfilled personal ambitions weigh heavily on him. Seraphina Whitaker, Nolan's wife, is in her mid-40s and an artist. She is graceful and warm-hearted, having always been the emotional anchor of the family. Recently, Seraphina feels increasingly overwhelmed by Nolan's growing distance and the responsibilities of managing their household. She is troubled by the strain on their marriage and her own postponed dreams. Elena Whitaker, their 17-year-old daughter, is introspective and artistic. She finds solace in drawing and photography, but has become more withdrawn due to the family's mounting tensions. The changes at home affect her deeply, causing her to retreat into her creative pursuits. Jax Whitaker, their 15-year-old son, is outgoing and active in sports. Although he maintains a cheerful demeanor, Jax is aware of the underlying issues within his family. He senses the growing tension but struggles to understand or address the root causes. The Whitaker family lives in a charming two-story house in Ambershade's Maple Grove neighborhood, surrounded by a well-kept garden. From the outside, their life seems ideal, but inside, things are unraveling. Nolan's increasing dissatisfaction leads him to question his career and marriage. This growing crisis affects every aspect of his life. Seraphina notices Nolan's detachment and makes several attempts to reconnect, but her efforts are met with silence and distance. The closeness they once shared is now strained, and the warmth of their home begins to fade. As Nolan struggles with his inner turmoil, he searches for something to rekindle the excitement he feels he has lost. This search sets off a series of events with serious consequences for his family. The decisions he makes during this period of crisis will have a profound and tragic impact on the lives of those he loves. Nolan Whitaker was a man who, on the surface, appeared to have everything anyone could want. In the early days of his career, he had carved out a remarkable career as a civil engineer, designing some of the most stunning homes in Ambershade. His reputation in the city was that of a skilled professional who could turn any vision into reality. People admired his work, his dedication, and his success. To the outside world, Nolan was a man who had it all: an impressive career, a beautiful home, and a loving family. But beneath this perfect facade, Nolan was anything but content. As he aged day by day, he started to feel the weight of time pressing down on him, like an invisible burden growing heavier each day. The passion he once felt for his work had gradually faded, replaced by a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. What once brought him joy and fulfillment now seemed like an endless cycle of monotony. The houses he designed were still beautiful, but the excitement he used to feel when creating them had disappeared. Nolan's mind began to wander, filled with thoughts that had never troubled him before. He started questioning the very choices that had led him to this point in life. Was this really what he had dreamed of? Had he made the right decisions? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that perhaps he had missed out on something more meaningful or adventurous. He wondered if he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the same routine without any new challenges or excitement on the horizon. These thoughts gnawed at him, day and night. They became a constant presence in his mind, like a shadow he couldn't escape. Yet, despite the growing unease, Nolan kept these feelings deeply buried. He was determined to maintain the image of a man in control, a man who had everything figured out. He didn't want to worry his family or disrupt the life they had built together. Seraphina, his wife, noticed the change in her husband. He had become more distant, more withdrawn. The man who once shared everything with her now seemed preoccupied, lost in his own thoughts. But Seraphina, ever supportive, assumed it was the stress of his demanding job. She believed that Nolan was simply under pressure from his work and that it would pass in time. She had no idea of the internal struggle he was facing, the fear that had taken root in his heart, the fear that his best years were already behind him. Nolan's dissatisfaction began to seep into other areas of his life. He found himself restless and irritable, no longer finding joy in the things that once made him happy. His relationship with Seraphina, once strong and close, started to feel strained, but still, he kept up the facade, unwilling to let anyone see the cracks forming beneath the surface. In his mind, Nolan couldn't help but wonder, was this really all there was to life? One day, he drove home in a sleek red sports car, a striking contrast to the practical family vehicles that lined the driveways of Ambershade. Seraphina was surprised by the purchase, but didn't think much of it at first. Nolan had always been a careful spender, so she assumed he simply wanted to treat himself to something nice, perhaps as a reward for all his hard work. But what Seraphina didn't realize was that the car was just the beginning. Over the next few months, Nolan's behavior began to change in ways that left Seraphina puzzled and concerned. He started spending more time away from home, often late into the evening. He joined a local gym, something he had never shown interest in before, and began dressing differently, swapping his usual attire for trendier, more youthful clothing. The biggest change, however, was the new group of friends Nolan began associating with. They were mostly younger, single men who were still in the prime of their lives, and they introduced Nolan to a lifestyle that was far removed from his responsibilities as a husband and father. At first, Seraphina tried to be understanding. She knew Nolan was going through something, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. When she asked him about the changes, Nolan brushed her off, assuring her that he just needed some time to himself. He claimed that the new activities were his way of relieving stress and feeling more energized. Seraphina wanted to believe him, but deep down, she felt a growing sense of unease. As the weeks went by, Nolan's transformation became more pronounced. He began to withdraw emotionally, leaving Seraphina feeling increasingly isolated. The man who once shared everything with her, the joys and challenges of his work, the ups and downs of their life together, was now a distant figure. The vibrant connection they once had was slowly eroding, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Seraphina missed the man Nolan used to be, the devoted husband and father who was always there for her, and the kids who used to light up when he talked about his work. But that man seemed to be slipping away, and Seraphina didn't know how to bring him back. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, Seraphina looked out the window at Nolan's new car parked in the driveway. It gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of the changes that were taking place in their lives. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to reach Nolan, how to bridge the growing gap between them. Seraphina tried to keep the family together, doing her best to fill the void that Nolan's absence had created. But the more she tried, the more distant Nolan became. His midlife crisis was no longer just a phase. It was a deep, internal struggle that was slowly unraveling the life they had built together. As Nolan continued down this path, the perfect facade of their life in Ambershade began to crack, revealing the turmoil beneath. As Nolan's midlife crisis deepened, the changes in his behavior became more drastic. He started coming home later and later, often with flimsy excuses that didn't quite add up. Seraphina noticed his reluctance to engage in family activities that he once enjoyed. Family dinners, weekend outings, even simple conversations became strained as Nolan seemed more interested in his new life outside of their home. The once warm and lively atmosphere in their household had turned cold, filled with awkward silences and unspoken tension. Seraphina couldn't ignore the changes any longer. She knew something was seriously wrong, but every time she tried to talk to Nolan, he would shut her down, insisting that everything was fine. He blamed work, saying that the pressure of his job was getting to him, and that he just needed time to unwind. but Seraphina wasn't convinced. She could see the distance in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze, the way he seemed preoccupied with something or someone else. One day, while cleaning the house, Seraphina stumbled upon a receipt in Nolan's jacket pocket. It was from an expensive restaurant in the city, a place they had never been to together. The date on the receipt was from a night when Nolan had told her he was working late. Her heart sank as she realized that Nolan had been lying to her. The reality of the situation began to hit her. Nolan was pulling away, and she was losing him. Determined to save her marriage, Seraphina knew she had to confront Nolan. She could no longer ignore the growing distance between them or pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. That evening, when Nolan returned home, she waited for the right moment to approach him. Her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination as she sat down at the kitchen table with him. Seraphina began by telling Nolan that they needed to talk. She expressed her concerns about the changes she had noticed in him. She pointed out how distant he had become and how much their relationship had suffered because of it. She mentioned finding a receipt that indicated he had been out for dinner without mentioning it to her, which further fueled her worries. Nolan's reaction was one of calm indifference. He explained that the dinner was nothing more than a casual outing with some friends from work. To him, it seemed insignificant, but to Seraphina, it was another sign of how disconnected they had become. She couldn't help but voice her frustrations, sharing how much she missed the man he used to be, the man who was present, loving, and deeply involved with his family. As the conversation continued, Nolan's frustration became apparent. He admitted that he was tired of the routine, the predictability of their life together, and the sense of being stuck in a never-ending loop. He tried to make Seraphina understand that his recent actions were his way of seeking something different, something exciting that had been missing from his life. Seraphina, on the other hand, struggled to comprehend how Nolan could feel this way without ever talking to her about it. She felt hurt and betrayed that he had shut her out, choosing instead to deal with his feelings alone. She questioned why he hadn't confided in her, why he had allowed the distance between them to grow so vast. Nolan had no clear answers. As Seraphina looked at him, she saw a man who was not only distant from her but also from himself. The person she had once known seemed lost, buried under layers of discontent and confusion. Seraphina realized that Nolan wasn't just pulling away from their marriage. He was pulling away from the life they had built together, and perhaps even from the person he had once been. In the weeks that followed Nolan and Seraphina's confrontation, the Whitaker household became a place of unbearable tension. The warmth that once filled their home had been replaced by a cold, strained atmosphere. Nolan moved into the guest room, and the physical separation between him and Seraphina symbolized the growing emotional distance that neither of them knew how to bridge. Seraphina did her best to maintain a semblance of normalcy for their children, Elna and Jax, but it was a daily struggle. Inside, she was barely holding it together. The betrayal had cut deep, leaving her with a sense of loss that she couldn't fully express. The man she had built her life with was now a stranger, and the future they had once dreamed of together seemed irreparably broken. Nolan, too, was unraveling. The guilt and shame of his affair with Alina consumed him. He knew he had destroyed the trust that had been the foundation of his marriage, and no matter how hard he tried to fix things, the damage had already been done. He attempted to end things with Alina, recognizing that their relationship was a mistake born out of his own midlife crisis and dissatisfaction. But the consequences of his actions were unavoidable. His marriage was in shambles, and his once close relationship with his children was deteriorating. Elena, who had always looked up to her father, was devastated. She could barely bring herself to speak to him, the hurt and confusion too much for her to bear. Jax, though too young to fully understand what was happening, sensed the tension in the house and began to withdraw into himself. The once lively and carefree child became quiet and sullen, a reflection of the turmoil that had overtaken his family. Overwhelmed by the betrayal and the breakdown of her marriage, Seraphina made the difficult decision to file for divorce. It was a step she had never imagined taking, but the pain of staying in a broken marriage was too much to bear. Nolan was devastated by her decision, though he knew it was inevitable. The affair had been a symptom of a deeper problem, his growing dissatisfaction with life, and his inability to face his fears and insecurities until it was too late. As the divorce proceedings began, Nolan's mental state continued to decline. He became increasingly isolated, withdrawing from the few friends and family members who still reached out to him. His once successful career as a civil engineer became an afterthought. He stopped going to work, too ashamed to face his colleagues and too consumed by his own despair to care about the projects that had once excited him. The affair with Alina had fizzled out, leaving him feeling even more alone and hollow than before. Seraphina, despite her own pain and anger, couldn't help but notice the change in Nolan. He was a ghost of the man he once was, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and consumed by a sadness that was impossible to ignore. Though she had every reason to hate him, she still cared for him on some level and tried to reach out to offer support. But Nolan, drowning in guilt and self-loathing, pushed her away. He was convinced that he didn't deserve her sympathy, that the hurt he had caused was beyond redemption. On the day the divorce papers were finalized, Nolan felt a darkness settle over him that he had never known before. The weight of the finality, the cold, unyielding reality that his marriage was over, pressed down on him like a heavy fog. For months he had clung to the hope that things could still be salvaged, that maybe, just maybe, Seraphina would change her mind. But now, as he stared at the crisp legal documents in his hands, that hope was snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The signature at the bottom of the page felt like the final nail in the coffin of the life he had once known. Nolan's thoughts spiraled as he left the courthouse, his mind racing with a mix of regret, anger, and despair. The world around him seemed muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on life itself. The bustling streets of Ambershade, with their busy taxis, vibrant cafes, and the hum of everyday life, felt distant and surreal. He walked aimlessly for a while, trying to escape the storm of emotions brewing inside him. But there was no escaping it. The reality of his situation was inescapable, and it followed him like a shadow, growing darker with each passing moment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Nolan found himself driving without a clear destination. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as he navigated the familiar streets of Ambershade. The city, once a place of hope and possibility, now felt like a labyrinth of memories he couldn't escape. Every corner, every landmark, reminded him of the life he had lost, the life he had destroyed with his own hands. Eventually, he drove his car to an outskirts of Ambershade, to a secluded spot that he and Seraphina had once cherished. It was a place steeped in nostalgia, where the two of them had spent countless afternoons together when their love was new and untainted by the hardships that would later tear them apart. The spot overlooked a serene lake, its waters calm and still, mirroring the dusky sky above. The gentle rustling of the trees and the soft chirping of crickets were the only sounds that filled the air, creating a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Nolan. He parked the car and turned off the engine, letting the silence envelop him. For a moment, he just sat there, staring out at the water, his mind a whirlwind of memories. He remembered their wedding day vividly, the way Seraphina had looked walking down the aisle, the warmth of her smile, the way her hand fit perfectly in his as they exchanged vows. He remembered the day Elena was born, the overwhelming love he had felt holding his daughter for the first time, and the joy of becoming a father. And he remembered the countless nights they had spent talking about their dreams for the future, their plans for growing old together, watching their children grow, and someday welcoming grandchildren into their lives. But those memories, once a source of comfort and happiness, were now tainted. They were like ghosts haunting him, reminding him of everything he had lost, everything he had destroyed. The pain of those memories was almost unbearable, a searing ache that cut through him like a knife. He couldn't stop thinking about the mistakes he had made, the lies he had told, the trust he had broken. He had hurt the people he loved most in the world, and now there was no going back. The finality of the divorce was proof of that. Nolan's thoughts grew darker as he sat there, alone with his regrets. He thought about Seraphina, about how she had once looked at him with such love and trust in her eyes. But that love had turned to anger, and that trust had been shattered. He thought about Elena, who had always seen him as her hero, her protector. But how could he be a hero when he had caused her so much pain? He thought about Jax, still so young and innocent, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the loss of his family falling apart. As the night grew darker, so did Nolan's thoughts. The weight of his guilt and despair became too much to bear. He couldn't see a way forward. How could he face the future when all he could see was the wreckage of his past? The thought of living without his family, without the people who had once been the center of his world, was unbearable. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, with nothing left to hold on to. In that moment of overwhelming despair, Nolan made a decision that would have tragic consequences. He couldn't bear the thought of living with the pain and guilt that consumed him. He couldn't bear the thought of facing another day in a world where he had lost everything that mattered to him. The idea of ending it all began to take root in his mind, offering a twisted sense of relief from the torment he was feeling. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, black case. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a handgun he had bought years ago, back when he still believed he needed to protect his family from the dangers of the world. Now it was the danger within himself that he feared most. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the gun, his mind a chaotic mix of fear, resignation, and a desperate longing for peace. Nolan thought about leaving a note, something to explain his actions, to tell his family how much he loved them, how sorry he was for everything. But what could he possibly say that would make any of it better? What words could ever convey the depth of his regret, the magnitude of his sorrow? In the end, he decided against it. He didn't want to burden them with more pain, more questions. He just wanted it to be over. With a heavy heart and tears streaming down his face, Nolan made his final decision. He pressed the gun to his temple, his hands shaking uncontrollably. In those last moments, his mind raced with thoughts of Seraphina, Elena, and Jax. He saw their faces, remembered their laughter, their love. But those memories, once so full of warmth, were now too painful to bear. The only thing he wanted was for the pain to stop. And then, in a single, tragic moment, it did. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the quiet night, cutting through the silence like a blade. The stillness of the secluded spot was shattered, replaced by a profound and eerie quiet that followed the deafening noise. Nolan slumped in his seat, his life extinguished in an instant, leaving behind nothing but the empty shell of the man he had once been. Hours passed before anyone found him. The next morning, a passerby noticed the car parked in the secluded spot, its engine cold and its windows fogged. When they approached, they saw the lifeless figure inside and called the authorities. The news spread quickly through Ambershade, sending shockwaves through the community. The news of Nolan's death shocked the community of Ambershade, where the Whitakers had long been seen as a cornerstone. Seraphina, Elena, and Jax were devastated, grappling with overwhelming guilt and sorrow. Seraphina was haunted by thoughts of what she might have done differently, while Elena struggled with the profound grief of losing her father, and Jax, too young to fully understand, was left confused and withdrawn. In the weeks following, the Whitakers faced the painful task of moving forward. Seraphina searched for answers in Nolan's belongings, discovering a man consumed by guilt and fear in his final days. The funeral was a somber reminder of life's fragility, leaving the family to confront the harsh reality of their loss and begin the slow process of healing. Want to see more like this? Then click on the video you are seeing on your screen now.